February 15, 1943, Luftwaffe Forward Command Post, Morozovsk. Oberst Heinrich Vogel stood before a map of the Eastern Front, his breath visible in the poorly heated briefing room. Outside, ground crews worked to repair 18 aircraft damaged in the previous night's raids. Sleep-deprived officers filled the wooden chairs, their eyes red from interrupted rest and the perpetual smoke of cheap cigarettes. 3 ammunition trains had exploded in the past week. Supply depots burned with mysterious regularity. Morale reports from forward positions mentioned men refusing to sleep, starting at every distant engine sound. Vogel had called this meeting to address what Berlin was calling the mosquito problem. "Gentlemen, we face an embarrassment," Vogel announced, lighting his own cigarette. "Soviet propaganda sends women against us. Women in crop dusters from 1928. Wooden biplanes that belong in agricultural fields, not combat operations." Laughter rippled through the room. Hauptmann Ernst Weber raised his glass of schnapps. "These Nachthexen fly without parachutes, without radios, without even enclosed cockpits. They drop bombs by hand like farmers throwing seeds." More laughter. Another officer called out, "Perhaps we should feel honored they consider us worth such desperate measures." Vogel smiled thinly. "Intelligence confirms these aircraft are PO2 trainers, 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower engines. Our Ju-88s could shoot them down in their sleep." The room erupted in confident agreement. Weber proposed a toast to easy victories and inexperienced Soviet women learning why men fly combat missions. What Oberst Vogel didn't know was that at that precise moment, 23-year-old Nadezhda Popova was already airborne 7 miles southeast of his position, approaching her target in complete darkness. She had enrolled in flying school at age 15, accumulating more flight hours than many Luftwaffe pilots before the war even started. The wooden aircraft Vogel dismissed so confidently was on its 407th mission toward what would eventually total 24,000 runs across the entire regiment. Popova herself would complete 852 combat sorties before war's end, dropping over 23 tons of explosives, surviving 6 aircraft shot from under her, and collecting fragments from 42 bullet holes in her logbook. Within 36 hours of Vogel's confident briefing, his own headquarters would burn, the fire visible for miles, started by 2 small bombs dropped so precisely they landed within meters of the ammunition storage he'd foolishly positioned underground beneath the command building. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the pinnacle of aeronautical engineering applied to combat reality. Every specification emerged from blood and failure. During the Battle of Britain, 73 Luftwaffe pilots died from hypothermia when damaged aircraft lost cabin pressurization, leading to mandatory enclosed cockpits with heating systems. The chaotic night skies over England saw 41 mid-air collisions between German aircraft, spurring requirements for advanced radio communication and coordination systems. Analysis of preventable casualties revealed that 30% of aircrew died in crashes they might have survived with proper escape equipment, establishing parachutes as non-negotiable standard issue. Speed requirements crystallized after multiple incidents where slower reconnaissance aircraft became easy prey for British fighters, setting 180 miles per hour as the absolute minimum for any combat-capable aircraft. The Junkers Ju-88 embodied these hard-won lessons perfectly. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, crew of 4 with dedicated roles, few G220 Liechtenstein radar for target detection, twin BMW engines producing 2,400 horsepower combined. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters destroyed 357 British bombers. German confidence wasn't arrogance. It was mathematics verified by corpses. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On August 8, 1942, she approached a German fuel depot outside Stalingrad, flying at barely 8,000 feet. No radio meant she communicated with her navigator using hand signals in complete darkness. No parachute meant the canvas straps crossing her chest held only her harness, not survival equipment. Her Po-2 cruised at 94 miles per hour, violating German minimum speed requirements by nearly half. The wooden airframe, covered in fabric, would splinter if hit, but lacked the metal necessary to mount armor or sophisticated equipment. She throttled back to 70 miles per hour on approach, the engine sound disappearing into ambient wind noise, and dropped 4 50-kilogram bombs manually from the rear cockpit. All 4 struck within the target perimeter. The depot burned for 3 days, consuming 30,000 liters of aviation fuel. This was mission number 241 of what would eventually become the 852 that made her name legendary, a fraction of the 24,000 runs the regiment would collectively complete. German intelligence reports from that week noted unexplained precision attacks by unidentified aircraft and recommended investigation into possible Soviet development of silent engine technology. They never considered the truth. The aircraft was simply too primitive, too slow, too quiet for modern detection systems to recognize as a threat. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established. The Polikarpov Po-2 was flying kindling, constructed from plywood frames covered in canvas fabric treated with paint that made it marginally less flammable but still fundamentally combustible. Open cockpit design exposed pilots to minus 40 degrees Celsius at altitude. Frostbite was so common the regiment tracked it like combat wounds. Pilots landed with their breath frozen to their scarves, ice crystals coating their eyelashes, their fingers barely able to grip controls. No equipment whatsoever meant no radios for coordination, forcing reliance on hand signals between navigator and pilot in pitch darkness. No parachutes because the aircraft flew too low for parachutes to deploy effectively before impact. No armor meant bullets passed through fabric and wood, encountering only air and the bodies of the 2 women aboard. Specifications made German engineers laugh. 94 miles per hour maximum speed versus the Ju-88's 300. Exactly 100 horsepower from a single M11 radial engine versus the German bomber's 2,400 horsepower. Designed in 1928, making it older than most of the women flying it. Cost approximately $5,000 to manufacture versus $80,000 for comparable German aircraft. Production time 3 weeks versus 3 months. The absurdity was complete. The Soviet Union had taken civilian crop dusters, attached bomb racks, and sent women to fight the most technologically advanced air force in history by hand-dropping explosives like medieval peasants throwing rocks from castle walls. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages. The Po-2's primitive simplicity meant a 4-minute refuel, 3-minute reload, and immediate return to combat. German bombers required extensive ground crew support, systems checks, crew rotation. Popova flew 8 missions in a single night, while Ju-88s completed 2. The fabric and wood construction that seemed suicidal actually saved lives. On September 23, 1942, German anti-aircraft fire stitched 24 bullet holes through her aircraft in a single attack run. Metal aircraft would have ricocheted bullets internally, shrapnel tearing through hydraulics and fuel lines and crew. Her Po-2's bullets passed through fabric, leaving holes but hitting nothing vital because there was nothing vital to hit. She landed safely, counted the holes, and was airborne again 90 minutes later. Asked by a reporter why she preferred the Po-2 to more modern aircraft, she reportedly said, "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, that bullet would have ricocheted until it found me. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours." An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated October 17, 1942, concluded, Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortage and declining manufacturing capacity. Wooden construction and primitive equipment render these aircraft extremely vulnerable to modern weapon systems. Physics remains immutable. Speed, metal construction, and modern technology always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete platforms. Current operations predicted to cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. Analysis calculates decisive advantages favoring Luftwaffe operations. 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24 to 1 horsepower differential, 15 to 1 cost efficiency, allowing numerical replacement. Assessment judges current activities as temporary morale impact only through sleep disruption, with no serious operational threat to strategic objectives. These aircraft lack capability for sustained combat operations against modern air defense systems. Recommendation: monitor activities but do not prioritize special countermeasures or divert resources from primary operations. Threat level classified minimal. This assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure. On October 21, 1942, 4 days after the official assessment, she approached a German ammunition train stopped at a rail junction near Gumrock. Her 6 bombs struck along the train's length. Secondary explosions continued for 4 hours. German logistics recorded catastrophic, unexplained losses that contradicted the assessment's optimistic predictions. By this point, she had conducted over 400 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet history, contributing to the regiment's eventual total of 24,000 runs. German supply officers filed reports noting ammunition shortages that made no mathematical sense given production and transport records. The quiet destruction continued nightly while German headquarters insisted the threat was minimal and temporary. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic seemed mathematically sound. Ju-88 at 300 miles per hour versus PO2 at 94 miles per hour equals 3.2 times speed advantage, which should translate directly into easy interception and destruction. German pilots trained extensively in pursuit techniques, angle calculations, deflection shooting. What they critically overlooked was that interception requires matching target speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic paradox lay in stall speeds. A Ju-88 stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour. Below that threshold, insufficient airflow over wings caused catastrophic loss of lift. The aircraft dropped from the sky like a brick. No amount of pilot skill changed physics. The PO2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide with engine off at 60 miles per hour. It flew below German minimum survivable speed. This created an impossible scenario. German pilots must fly past targets too quickly to effectively engage, or slow down to match Soviet speed and risk catastrophic stall. No middle ground existed. September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted interception of a PO2. He reduced speed to 130 miles per hour to establish firing position. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled back to 70 miles per hour, beginning a shallow glide. Schmidt's aircraft displayed stall warnings, wings wobbling, controls becoming mushy and unresponsive. He advanced throttle and climbed away, or crashed. His report stated, target speed below minimum engagement threshold, interception impossible under current aerodynamic constraints. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable in ways German doctrine couldn't comprehend. During a mission over Taman Peninsula, she detected a German fighter approaching from above using sound alone since she had no radar. She immediately throttled to minimum power and descended into ground clutter. The German made 3 passes, overshooting each time, unable to slow enough to track her movement without entering stall regime. On his final attempt, approaching dangerously close to stall speed with wings visibly wobbling in moonlight, he was forced to abandon pursuit or crash. She completed her mission unharmed. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions and multiplied across the 24,000 runs the Night Witches flew collectively, proved the PO2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and the Night Witches flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated Hauptmann Schmidt and dozens of other German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. The physics problem extended beyond simple inability to slow down. German fighters were optimized for intercepting Soviet bombers like the Il-4 and Pe-2, aircraft that cruised at 250 miles per hour. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters were designed to chase, to pursue, to close distance rapidly against targets trying to flee. Their aerodynamic profiles, engine power curves, and control surface responses all assumed engagement with fast-moving targets. Physics provided no middle ground. At 300 miles per hour cruising speed, overshooting a target moving 80 miles per hour was inevitable. Slowing to 150 miles per hour brought dangerous proximity to the 120 mile per hour stall threshold, where wings stopped generating lift and aircraft became falling metal coffins. The POW-2, operating at 80 miles per hour, capable of gliding at 60 miles per hour with engines completely idle, existed in an untouchable zone below German minimum survivable speed. German pilots trained extensively for pursuit tactics, deflection shooting, and high-speed intercepts. None of this training addressed precision slow-speed engagement because doctrine assumed no combat aircraft would be insane enough to fly that slowly. Target acquisition at high differential speeds provided approximately 2 to 3 seconds of weapons window. At a speed difference of 200 miles per hour, weapons lock became mathematically impossible before the fighter overshot and had to circle back for another futile attempt. On November 3, 1942, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 512th mission. Her target was a German supply depot outside Krimsk, storing winter clothing desperately needed by forward units. She detected the Bf-110 night fighter by its distinctive engine note while still 8 miles from target. Her immediate response followed doctrine she'd helped develop. Throttle to minimum power, reducing speed to 65 miles per hour, descending to 3,000 feet where ground clutter confused German radar. The Bf-110 made 4 passes. On the first, he overshot by nearly 2 miles before banking steeply to circle back. On the second pass, the pilot attempted to slow his approach, and Popova watched his wings wobble visibly in the moonlight as he neared stall speed, forced to abort and apply full throttle. The third and fourth passes showed increasing desperation, the German pilot trying different angles of attack, all failing as physics made engagement impossible. Each pass gave Popova time to adjust course incrementally toward her target. She completed her bombing run while the German fighter burned fuel attempting intercepts that aerodynamics rendered futile. This tactic, perfected over what would eventually total 24,000 runs across the entire Night Witches regiment, meant mission 512 of her eventual 852 ended like hundreds before. Target destroyed, PO-2 returned safely. German filed reports stating, target successfully evaded engagement through unconventional low-speed maneuvering. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO-2's greatest vulnerability. The physics of bullet impact depended entirely on target material. When bullets struck metal aircraft, they penetrated aluminum skin, creating shrapnel, then ricocheted inside the fuselage like deadly pinballs, hitting fuel lines, hydraulic systems, control cables, and crew in unpredictable patterns. German ammunition was specifically designed for metal targets, armor-piercing rounds that wasted enormous energy penetrating armor the PO-2 didn't have, explosive rounds that detonated on impact with metal, incendiary tracers that ignited metal fuel tanks. A canvas aircraft presented completely different physics. Bullets passed through fabric, exited the other side, transferred minimal energy, and created no shrapnel. Wood frames meant bullets made clean holes unless they directly struck a structural spar. Vital systems occupied a small percentage of total aircraft volume. The engine, fuel tank, and 2 crew members represented perhaps 15% of the plane's physical space. The other 85% was canvas and air. Canvas tiers didn't significantly affect aerodynamics. A wing could have 50 holes and still generate lift. Repairs required 30 minutes with canvas patches and glue versus hours of metal welding requiring specialized equipment and skilled labor. German pilots repeatedly reported hits without kills, filing frustrated after-action reports noting multiple strikes observed, no effect on target capability. Aircraft continued mission operations. During her 607th mission on January 18, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively. Approaching a German artillery position near Novorossiysk, she flew directly through a concentration of machine gun fire that German gunners later reported as impossible to miss at that range. 42 bullet holes were counted by ground crew upon her return. 27 holes in the upper wing alone created a pattern that looked like deliberate perforation. Bullets had passed through the fuselage 6 inches behind her seat, through the lower wing's fabric on both sides, through the tail assembly, through the canvas covering the rear cockpit where her navigator sat. One bullet passed so close to Popova's head that it tore through the leather of her flight helmet without touching skin. The aircraft was deemed airworthy. She flew 2 more missions that night in the same damaged aircraft before ground crew performed permanent repairs. This particular PO2 would carry her through 93 more missions before being retired for accumulated damage. When interviewed by a regimental commander investigating why casualties remained so low despite heavy fire, Popova stated, "In their metal planes, I would be dead. The bullets are designed to kill metal. We don't fly metal." By this point in her career, approaching 700 missions toward her eventual 852, she had survived 6 aircraft shot from under her, accumulating bullet holes the way other pilots accumulated flight hours. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide targeting coordinates. Standard defensive procedures followed predictable sequences. Auditory sensors detected engine sounds, searchlights activated to acquire visual contact, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on illuminated targets, fighter aircraft scrambled to intercept. The Night Witches discovered a tactic that rendered this entire system useless, possibly by accident initially when damaged engines forced gliding returns. The technique became standard doctrine. Approach target at 8,000 feet with engines at full throttle, allowing Germans to hear and prepare defenses. At 3,000 feet altitude, approximately 5 miles from target, cut engines completely to idle. The PO2's favorable glide ratio of approximately 1 foot altitude lost per 10 feet forward distance meant 3,000 feet of altitude provided 30,000 feet of gliding distance, roughly 5.6 miles. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, this represented 5.6 minutes of completely silent approach. The only sound was wind rushing through canvas wings, a soft rustling that blended into ambient night noise. Physics provided the Night Witches with perfect stealth. Germans heard engines, prepared defenses, waited, heard nothing, stood down, relaxed, then explosions occurred before they understood aircraft had been overhead in total silence. Searchlights swept empty sky. Anti-aircraft crews fired at nothing. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage. German soldiers reported hearing phantom engines, experiencing auditory hallucinations, refusing to sleep even during confirmed quiet periods. On the night of March 7, 1943, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach 8 times across multiple targets. On her 14th sortie toward what would eventually become 852, she targeted a German command post coordinating artillery fire near Taman Peninsula. She approached with engines loud and obvious, allowing German defenders to activate searchlights and prepare weapons. At 2,800 feet, she cut her engine completely. The sudden silence was absolute. She glided directly over German positions, low enough to hear soldiers calling to each other in German. "Wo sind die Flugzeuge?" Where are the aircraft? Searchlights swept back and forth, searching for targets their ears had promised, but their eyes couldn't find. She dropped 4 bombs with precision impossible during evasive maneuvering, the explosions illuminating upturned faces looking at empty sky with comprehension arriving too late. She restarted her engine only after clearing the target area, the sudden sound behind German lines adding to their confusion about direction and number of attackers. She would repeat this silent approach across the 24,000 collective runs the Night Witches flew, the tactic becoming so routine that new pilots were surprised when told German defensive doctrine was considered sophisticated. As Popova reportedly told a younger pilot during training, "We are ghosts, they cannot fight. They fear the silence more than the bombs, because the silence means they're already dead and just don't know it yet." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The impressive specifications of the Junkers Ju-88 told only part of the story. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin engines, advanced FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar for target detection, sophisticated radio communication systems, armor protection, crew of 4 with dedicated specialists. Cost and production requirements revealed operational constraints the specifications concealed. Each Ju-88 cost approximately $80,000 and required 3 months to manufacture with skilled labor and precision tooling. Operational tempo was limited to 1 or 2 sorties per night maximum. Maintenance between missions consumed 3 to 4 hours for systems checks, refueling with high-octane aviation fuel, rearming weapons, and mandatory crew rest periods. Crew fatigue became critical, with 4 men coordinating in high-stress environments with lives depending on split-second communication. The average Ju-88 night fighter operational career spanned 40 to 60 missions before loss or crew rotation due to psychological strain. Survival rates hovered around 60%, with many losses attributed not to combat but to weather, navigation errors, mechanical failures, and training accidents. The sophistication that made the Ju-88 formidable also made it fragile, dependent on supply chains, maintenance infrastructure, and crew coordination that could fail at multiple points. The PO-2 embodied opposite philosophy. Primitive specifications concealed operational advantages: 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower from a single radial engine, no radar, no radio communication, no armor protection, crew of 2 women. Cost and production reflected different priorities. $5,000 per aircraft required 3 weeks to build with minimal skilled labor. Operational tempo reached 8 to 18 sorties per night when missions demanded. Maintenance between missions totaled 7 minutes. 4 minutes for refueling with low-grade fuel that any vehicle could provide. 3 minutes for reloading bombs that 2 people could handle. Crew coordination was intuitive after hundreds of missions together. 2 women who understood each other's movements through experience rather than radio commands. The average Night Witch career spanned 800 to 1,000 missions. Survival rates reached 96.8%, with losses almost entirely from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The paradox defied German military logic. More expensive and sophisticated aircraft produced lower operational effectiveness, while simpler and cheaper aircraft produced higher operational effectiveness. German advantages in technology became disadvantages in logistics. Every engineering improvement that made German aircraft superior in specifications made them inferior in operations. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record. Between August 1942 and May 1945, she averaged 28 missions per month, never missing more than 3 consecutive nights except during 2 periods of injury recovery. Her 852 missions represented more sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters completed collectively. On exceptional nights, she demonstrated the tempo German commanders considered impossible. One night in February 1943, she completed 11 missions between 2200 hours and 0530 hours, averaging 43 minutes per complete cycle, including flight to target, bombing run, return flight, refueling, reloading, and launch. Ground crew efficiency meant mechanics prepared her aircraft faster than she could walk from debriefing to cockpit. She dropped 66 bombs that single night, hitting 2 ammunition dumps, 3 vehicle parks, 4 troop positions, and 2 supply convoys. German casualties from her missions that night exceeded 200 killed or wounded, with material losses valued at over 3 million Reichsmarks. The most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot achieved maximum force sorties in a single night under ideal conditions. Her 852 missions by war's end translated to 34 complete American tour rotations, since USAF bomber crews rotated home after 25 missions. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons. Her personal tonnage of bombs dropped exceeded many strategic bombing campaigns. By late 1943, German soldiers had learned to recognize the sound of her specific engine, which ground crew had modified slightly for reliability, and would call warnings when they heard it approaching. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern that contradicted official assessments of minimal threat. German expenditure attempting to stop the Night Witches specifically, separate from general air defense costs, revealed catastrophic resource misallocation. Anti-aircraft ammunition fired at Night Witches over 3 years exceeded 2 million rounds. At 50 Reichsmarks per artillery shell, this represented 100 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to $40 million in contemporary value. Fighter sorties dedicated to Night Witch interception attempts exceeded 1,000 missions. At 500 Reichsmarks operational cost per sortie, including fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and crew pay, this added 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries deployed specifically for night harassment defense numbered over 200 units requiring continuous operation, power generation, and maintenance. Personnel assigned to counter-night harassment operations exceeded 5,000 soldiers who could have served in combat roles elsewhere. Total German expenditure over the war approached 50 million Reichsmarks, attempting to neutralize a threat that killed relatively few soldiers directly, but disrupted operations systematically. Soviet investment in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment told different story. 40 PO2 aircraft at $5,000 each totaled $200,000 initial investment. Ammunition costs for bombs represented a fraction of the defensive ammunition expended against them. Personnel totaled 80 pilots and navigators plus minimal ground crew, approximately 150 people total. Total Soviet investment remained under $2 million for the entire regiment across the entire war. The cost ratio was devastating. Germans spent 25 times more trying to stop night witches than Soviets spent creating and maintaining them. Effectiveness made disparity worse. Germans achieved 0 confirmed kills of night witches by fighter aircraft. All losses came from ground fire, and those losses totaled 32 aircraft and 28 personnel over 3 years, a casualty rate that would be considered miraculously low in any other context. The result embodied perfect asymmetric warfare, minimal investment producing maximum enemy resource drain with near zero losses. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency concentrated in one woman. If German forces fired an average of 1,000 anti-aircraft rounds attempting to hit her per mission, conservative estimate based on defensive density in areas she operated, her 852 missions meant 852,000 rounds fired specifically at her over the course of the war. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, German forces spent 42,600,000 Reichsmarks attempting to kill one Soviet pilot. She survived. Her bombs across 852 missions destroyed estimated 60 tons of ammunition, approximately 80 vehicles including tanks and trucks, killed or wounded over 3,000 German personnel directly, and disrupted operations affecting tens of thousands more through psychological impact and infrastructure damage. Value of German material destroyed exceeded 150 million Reichsmarks. She cost Germany 3 times more in actual damage than Germany spent trying to kill her, and that calculation ignored the psychological and operational disruption that exceeded material losses. The average USAAF bomber crew rotated home after completing 25 missions. Popova completed 852 missions, equivalent to 34 full American tours of duty, more combat sorties than many entire bomber groups. Representing operational efficiency no German planning had anticipated or countered. She was one pilot among 80 in her regiment. The collective 852 became part of 24,000 runs the Night Witches flew collectively, each mission representing similar cost-benefit disparity. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets. And Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would transform harassment into humiliation. On October 17, 1942, a Wehrmacht mechanized unit overran a Soviet airfield near Maikop during a rapid advance designed to capture Caucasus oil facilities. Soviet personnel had evacuated hastily, abandoning equipment and documentation in their retreat. A German intelligence officer, Hauptmann Ernst Kohler, entered the operations building expecting standard military paperwork. The first document he examined was a flight roster. The names stopped him immediately. Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershanskaya, Commander; Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, Pilot; Junior Lieutenant Yevdokia Nosal, Navigator. Every name was unmistakably female. Kohler's initial assumption was clerical error, or perhaps an administrative unit stationed at a combat airfield. The second document eliminated that possibility. Personnel records showed birth dates revealing ages between 18 and 23, positions listed as combat pilot and combat navigator, and service records dating to May 1942. The third document proved conclusive. Award citations for multiple pilots mentioning pilot-navigator pairs with feminine grammatical endings throughout, combat mission counts in the hundreds, and references to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Kohler cross-referenced names with recovered pilot logbooks found in the barracks. The same names appeared across hundreds of documented missions with specific targets, dates, bomb loads, and results meticulously recorded. The realization arrived slowly, fought against by trained skepticism, but became unavoidable. These were not administrative personnel. These were the actual combat pilots flying the missions that had cost German forces millions in resources and thousands in casualties. Kohler marked his report, "Urgent, requires immediate verification," and sent it directly to division headquarters. The report reached Battalion Commander Oberstleutnant Friedrich Werner within hours. Werner's initial response was predictable dismissal. Soviet disinformation, propaganda stunt, isolated women ferrying aircraft while men flew combat. Multiple confirmations arrived the same week from different sectors along the front. A downed PO-2 near Krimsk produced a female pilot's body. Captured personnel near Novorossiysk included 2 women in flight suits with combat mission logs exceeding 300 sorties each. The pattern became undeniable. Werner escalated the report to Division Intelligence, which forwarded it to Corps, then Army Group, each level repeating the cycle of initial disbelief, followed by verification, demands followed by confirmation. Wehrmacht Intelligence Headquarters assigned priority investigation. Within 2 weeks, analysis was complete. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, formed May 1942 under Marina Raskova's command, consisted entirely of female personnel including pilots, navigators, mechanics, and support staff. The unit had been operational for 5 months. German forces had engaged this unit hundreds of times without recognizing its composition. In November 1942, a briefing at Army Group South headquarters confronted senior officers with evidence they could not dismiss. General Major Kurt Hoffmann presented intelligence findings, captured documents, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance photographs showing women boarding aircraft at Soviet airfields, and the devastating correlation between raid patterns and this specific unit's deployment history. Officers examined captured flight suits sized for smaller frames, logbooks with feminine handwriting, and identification documents with photographs of young women. Cross-referencing confirmed specific aircraft serial numbers appearing in multiple raid reports over months matched aircraft assigned to female pilots. The conclusion was unavoidable and humiliating. Women were responsible for the systematic harassment that had disrupted operations, destroyed supplies, and cost the Wehrmacht resources equivalent to an armored division. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that transcended tactical concerns and struck at ideological foundations. Disbelief persisted among many officers who demanded additional proof, refusing to accept that elite Luftwaffe training and sophisticated aircraft had been defeated by women flying agricultural trainers. Humiliation ran deeper than professional pride. Every failed interception, every destroyed supply depot, every sleepless night attributed to Soviet harassment operations was suddenly reframed as defeat by female pilots the German military doctrine considered incapable of combat aviation. Nazi ideology explicitly defined women's roles as domestic, maternal, and supporting, never combat leadership. Propaganda Minister Goebbels had spent years promoting German women as mothers of the Reich, while Soviet women were portrayed as masculinized aberrations of Bolshevism. The night witches proved propaganda was fiction, and ideology was liability. Practical military concern emerged from this ideological failure. If German assumptions about women's combat capabilities were this catastrophically wrong, what else had doctrine misjudged about Soviet capabilities? Some Luftwaffe pilots quietly requested transfers to other theaters rather than remain in sectors where they might engage night witches, preferring to face American B-17s than admit being consistently defeated by women flying wooden biplanes. Others insisted on bureaucratic language sanitization. Official reports began referring to Soviet night harassment units without gender specification. Luftwaffe High Command issued explicit directives suppressing information, fearing wider morale impact if frontline soldiers learned the full truth. Operational Order 4427, dated November 28, 1942, stated, All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. Classification of this information is mandatory. Frontline soldiers' reactions differed from officer corps embarrassment, grudging respect mixed with primal fear. The nickname Nachthexen spread rapidly through Wehrmacht units despite official discouragement, the term carrying supernatural connotations that rationalized defeats physics and doctrine couldn't explain. Some German units began requesting dedicated anti-Night Witch resources. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing only on tactical threat while avoiding psychological implications. While German command struggled with revelations that shattered assumptions, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause or concern for enemy psychological crisis. On October 19, 1942, she was flying her 634th mission, unaware that Germans had discovered her identity 2 days earlier. Her target was a German fuel depot outside Tuapse. She approached in silence, dropped 4 bombs with characteristic precision, and returned to base for immediate turnaround. By the time Wehrmacht intelligence confirmed her regiment's composition, she had already completed over 600 of her eventual 852 missions, contributing to the 24,000 runs the regiment would fly collectively. The discovery changed nothing about her operational tempo or effectiveness. On November 30, 1942, she destroyed a German ammunition train near Krimsk. German logistics reported the loss as catastrophic unexplained destruction. The report made no mention that the pilot responsible was a 23-year-old woman they now knew existed, but still couldn't stop. When informed months later that Germans had learned about the regiment's composition, Popova's response was characteristically direct. "We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs." The discovery changed nothing operationally. The Night Witches continued flying. Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners during systematic documentation of Eastern Front operations between 1945 and 1946. Interrogators asking about combat experiences received expected responses about tank battles, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults. When questions turned specifically to night operations and the 588th Regiment, unexpected consistency emerged in prisoner responses. Even hardened SS officers showed visible reactions to the topic, voices changing pitch, body language shifting from defiant to uncomfortable. One American interrogator noted in his report, subject became agitated when asked about Soviet night bomber operations, exhibiting stress responses inconsistent with discussions of conventional combat. Pattern repeated across multiple prisoners regardless of rank or unit. A pattern emerged across hundreds of interviews revealing psychological impact that transcended simple military defeat. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Schultz, Ju-88 night fighter pilot assigned to NJG-4, captured near Berlin in April 1945, provided testimony that interrogators initially flagged as potentially unreliable. "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in August 1942. Command briefed us on Soviet harassment operations, but provided no details about personnel. I attempted interception 17 times across 6 months, 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement parameters. My stall warnings activated every time I attempted to match their speed. Training prepares you for pursuit, deflection shooting, high-speed intercepts. Nothing prepares you for targets that fly below your minimum speed threshold." It was humiliating professionally. We had mastered the Ju-88. We had faced British Lancaster bombers over Germany. We understood air combat doctrine. Then wooden biplanes made us look like student pilots. When I learned after surrender they were women, I had no words. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't allow it. Gender was irrelevant to aerodynamics. They had beaten the laws of aircraft performance itself. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, anti-aircraft battery commander deployed in eastern Ukraine from 1942 to 1944, provided corroborating testimony from ground perspective. "My battery fired approximately 40,000 rounds at these aircraft between September 1942 and August 1943. We achieved perhaps 4 confirmed hits across that period. They would approach with engines producing sound. We would prepare defensive positions and activate searchlights, then silence. Complete silence. We would fire at estimated positions based on sound memory, but we were shooting at assumptions. The engine sound would return after explosions, always from unexpected directions. Psychological effect on my men was severe. Sleep deprivation, constant alert status, inability to predict attacks. We feared the silence more than the explosive damage. Learning they were women pilots only compounded the sense that we had fundamentally underestimated this enemy's capabilities and our own vulnerabilities. Common themes emerged across testimonies without requiring statistical analysis. Nearly every prisoner mentioned silence and its psychological impact, with descriptions ranging from unnatural to supernatural. Repeated failures attempting interceptions due to speed differential appeared in testimony from night fighter pilots, regardless of aircraft type or experience level. Almost universal shock upon learning pilot gender manifested differently by personality. Some prisoners attempted rationalization, claiming Soviet propaganda exaggerated female involvement. Others admitted gender made no tactical difference to combat effectiveness. The phrase, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in variant forms across dozens of interviews, suggesting either common briefing language or shared experiential conclusion. Several prisoners mentioned specific Night Witch aircraft by reputation or distinctive markings without knowing pilot names, suggesting German forces tracked individual aircraft that appeared repeatedly. Most significantly, testimonies acknowledged propaganda about Soviet inferiority had been comprehensively wrong, representing rare admission from prisoners otherwise defensive about German military performance. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name at the time. Lieutenant Otto Brandt, infantry company commander stationed near Taman Peninsula from late 1942 through 1943, provided detailed account. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize by distinctive repair patch patterns on both wings. Canvas patches in specific configuration made it identifiable even in darkness when illuminated briefly by explosions or searchlights. This aircraft appeared over our positions on average 3 to 4 times weekly. We began calling it Der Geist, the Ghost, because it invariably arrived in complete silence despite our listening posts maintaining constant vigilance. I personally witnessed this aircraft's attacks 9 times. On February 8, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of our layout. On March 14, 1943, it hit our command post during officers' briefing, killing 4, including my battalion commander. We never came close to effective engagement. After surrender, I accessed Soviet military records through American interrogators. Cross-referencing dates and locations indicated this was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Records showed she had flown 852 missions during the war. My sector represented perhaps 50 of those missions. She was untouchable. We expended thousands of rounds attempting to hit that aircraft. Every attempt failed. Popova learned about German prisoner testimonies mentioning her specifically during post-war interviews conducted by Soviet military historians documenting the 588th Regiment's operations. Her response reflected characteristic pragmatism. If they recognized my aircraft, it meant I was doing my job consistently. If they couldn't shoot me down, it meant my tactics were sound. Whether they respected or feared or were humiliated by learning we were women was immaterial to the mission. She continued flying combat operations until Germany's surrender in May 1945, maintaining operational tempo that never decreased regardless of German knowledge or attempts at countermeasures. Her final mission count of 852 represented one of the highest combat sortie totals in aviation history, contributing to the 24,000 runs collectively flown by the Night Witches. German testimonies confirmed what Soviet command had known since 1942. The 588th Regiment represented asymmetric warfare perfection, achieving strategic impact through tactical persistence while suffering minimal casualties, despite operating in one of history's most lethal combat environments. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The Night Witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front. and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier. Her 852 combat missions represented more sorties than most bomber squadrons completed collectively. Operating from May 1942 through the war's conclusion, she averaged 28 missions monthly, maintaining this tempo through brutal winters that grounded conventional aircraft, through injuries that would have ended most military careers, and through losses of squadron mates that would have broken lesser resolve. Each mission averaged 90 minutes from takeoff to landing, totaling over 1,200 flight hours spent in an open cockpit at altitudes where temperatures regularly reached -40 degrees Celsius. She dropped approximately 23 tons of explosives with precision that German logistics officers recorded as impossibly accurate for claimed aircraft specifications. She survived the entire war without being shot down despite flying through some of the most heavily defended airspace on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union awarded her Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor, along with multiple Orders of the Red Banner, Orders of the Red Star, and commendations that filled her service record. But the numbers themselves, sterile in their precision, inadequately captured what 852 missions meant in human terms. Each sortie represented physical agony from frostbite that left permanent scars on her hands and face, hearing damage from hours of engine noise without protection, and the psychological weight of knowing that every flight could end in flames. 28 of her fellow night witches died during operations. She attended their memorials between missions, then climbed back into her PO2 because the war continued regardless of grief. To understand the magnitude of these numbers, context matters. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 missions across their entire careers before being rotated to training duties or killed in action. Popova completed 852. The United States Army Air Forces rotated bomber crews home after completing 25 missions, considering this sufficient exposure to combat stress. Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American combat tours without rotation, without relief, without the option to go home until victory was achieved. The average Soviet male bomber pilot flew between 150 and 300 missions during the war. She exceeded the highest performers by nearly 300%. Within the 588th Regiment itself, where the average pilot completed 500 to 600 missions, Popova exceeded her peers by over 250 sorties. Her 852 missions represented more combat flights than some entire bomber groups combined across all theaters. If each mission averaged 2 hours, including preparation and post-flight procedures, she spent over 1,700 hours directly engaged in combat operations. At an average bomb load of 200 kilograms per sortie, she personally delivered 170 tons of high explosives onto German positions with documented accuracy that destroyed ammunition trains, supply depots, command posts, vehicle concentrations, and artillery batteries. Conservative estimates suggest her missions directly resulted in over 2,000 German casualties and material losses exceeding 15 million Reichsmarks. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat aviation roles that traditional military doctrine considered inappropriate. Between May 1942 and May 1945, the regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties, an operational tempo that exceeded many conventional bomber units despite flying obsolete aircraft without sophisticated navigation or communication equipment. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs, with cumulative accuracy that German logistics reported as strategically significant disruption to supply operations throughout the southern and eastern fronts. Conservative estimates place German casualties inflicted by night witch operations at 5,000 killed or wounded, with material destruction including hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, and countless installations valued collectively at over 50 million Reichsmarks. The regiment operated continuously for 3 years under conditions that grounded conventional bombers, maintaining mission schedules through winter storms, summer heat, mechanical failures, And personnel losses. Regiment casualties totaled 32, killed from approximately 80 personnel, representing a 96.8% survival rate that contrasted sharply with conventional Soviet bomber units experiencing 40 to 60% survival rates. The cost-effectiveness validated asymmetric warfare principles. The regiment cost approximately $2 million to create and maintain, yet inflicted damage worth over $50 million while forcing Germans to expend 125 million Reichsmarks, attempting to counter them. Germans spent 60 times more trying to stop night witches than Soviets spent creating and sustaining them. German forces achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of night witches through fighter interception, despite over 1,000 dedicated attempts. Almost all regiment losses resulted from ground fire, not air combat, proving the stall speed paradox remained unsolvable throughout the war. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the night witches provided beyond measurable destruction. German troops throughout the southern and eastern fronts experienced systematic psychological degradation from sleep deprivation, constant alert status, and inability to predict or prevent attacks that arrived in silence. Wehrmacht medical reports documented increased cases of combat fatigue, anxiety disorders, and disciplinary problems in units subjected to sustained night witch harassment. German High Command diverted over 5,000 soldiers to dedicated air defense duties attempting to counter night harassment, removing these personnel from frontline combat roles where they were desperately needed during Soviet offensives. The night witches forced German logistics to route supply convoys through longer, more vulnerable paths to avoid known harassment zones, adding hundreds of kilometers to transport distances and exposing supplies to additional interdiction opportunities. Soviet propaganda leveraged night witch operations to demonstrate that Soviet women could fight as effectively as men, boosting domestic morale and countering German propaganda about Soviet weakness. Perhaps most significantly, German miscalculation regarding night witch capabilities exposed fundamental flaws in Wehrmacht intelligence assessment and doctrinal inflexibility that contributed to broader strategic failures throughout the Eastern Front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly noted in his memoirs, "The night witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them." In warfare, this represents perfect efficiency. The 588th Regiment proved that technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and that determination can overcome engineering advantages. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle, and the regiment's 24,000 collective runs validated it at scale. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced challenges that differed profoundly from nightly combat, but proved equally demanding in their own way. Initial recognition came swiftly. Hero of the Soviet Union ceremonies, victory parades through Moscow where crowds cheered her regiment, speeches where officials praised their contributions to defeating fascism. But returning to civilian life after 3 years of nightly missions proved psychologically difficult. She struggled with insomnia, hypervigilance to distant engine sounds, and survivor's guilt about comrades who hadn't returned. She remained in aviation, becoming a flight instructor and sharing expertise accumulated across 852 combat missions with new generations of Soviet pilots. She married fellow pilot Semyon Kharlamov in 1946. Their relationship forged through shared understanding of combat experiences civilians couldn't comprehend. Soviet recognition fluctuated with political climate. Stalin initially celebrated war heroes but later suppressed those he hadn't personally favored or who threatened his cult of personality. Popova's recognition remained consistent due to her documented record, though some night witches experienced decades of official neglect before glasnost allowed their stories to emerge. She received additional honors throughout her life: multiple commemorative medals, inclusion in official Soviet military histories, invitations to speak at military academies. She maintained close relationships with surviving squadron mates, gathering annually to remember the 28 who died and celebrate survival against odds that favored none of them. She advocated quietly but persistently for recognition of women's military contributions, pushing against Soviet bureaucracy that preferred emphasizing male heroism. Nadezhda Popova died in 2013 at age 91, having lived longer after the war than most of her generation. Her hometown erected a monument honoring her service, and Russian Air Force Museum exhibitions feature her flight suit, medals, and logbook documenting 852 missions in her own handwriting. For decades, the Night Witches remained virtually unknown in the West. Cold War dynamics meant Soviet military histories were dismissed as propaganda, and the implausibility of women flying wooden biplanes against the Luftwaffe seemed to confirm Western skepticism about Soviet claims. The 1980s Glasnost period allowed previously restricted information to emerge, including detailed operational records, photographs, and testimony from surviving Night Witches. Through the 1990s and 2000s, historians gained access to Soviet archives and began systematic documentation of the 588th Regiment's operations. German testimonies from prisoner interrogations, declassified decades after the war, corroborated Soviet accounts with uncomfortable precision. Western recognition grew through the 2010s as books, documentaries, and films brought Night Witch stories to broader audiences. Museums now feature their history. Russian Air Force Museum maintains exhibits with actual PO-2 aircraft and Night Witch memorabilia, while Western aviation museums have created displays explaining this unique chapter of military aviation history. Monuments and memorials honor the regiment throughout Russia and former Soviet territories. Schools and streets bear names of Night Witch pilots. Films and documentaries have introduced their story to millions who had never heard of women flying combat missions in wooden biplanes. Nadezhda Popova specifically has been honored through biographical works, museum exhibits featuring her personal effects, and continued recognition from Russian military establishment as exemplifying courage and skill under impossible conditions. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment to reveal universal principles about warfare and human capability. Their success demonstrated that asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when applied with sufficient skill and determination. The psychological impact of silent gliding attacks often exceeded physical damage, proving that fear can be as strategically valuable as destruction. Innovation mattered more than resources. Soviet forces created effective weapons from agricultural trainers, while Germans wasted sophisticated aircraft attempting futile interceptions. Underestimating enemies based on gender or equipment primitiveness created vulnerabilities Germans never recognized until too late. German assumptions about women's combat capabilities and PO-2 obsolescence blinded them to threats that cost millions in resources and thousands in casualties. The Night Witches proved that perceived weakness can become actual strength when tactical doctrine transforms limitations into advantages. Flying 852 missions required extraordinary physical resilience to endure frostbite, exhaustion, and fear across 3 years without respite. Each mission could be her last, yet Popova continued because survival required not just skill and luck, but absolute refusal to quit. The story also reveals truths about physics and engineering. Sometimes simple design beats complex systems when operational requirements favor simplicity over sophistication. Canvas that bullets passed through proved more survivable than metal that created shrapnel. Understanding operational environment mattered more than theoretical specifications. Stall speed paradox made slow aircraft untouchable by fast interceptors. Constraints forced innovation that advantages might have prevented. Silence tactics emerged from necessity and became devastating psychological weapons. The German officer who stood in that briefing room in February 1943, laughing at women in crop dusters and predicting easy victories, never lived to understand what Nadezhda Popova proved across 852 missions and what the Night Witches demonstrated through 24,000 collective runs. They proved that courage doesn't require the best equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, and that determination makes physics itself irrelevant when tactics transform limitations into advantages. Her 852 missions weren't just sorties logged in military records. They were proof that Germans calculated thrust and speed and firepower, but missed the variable that mattered most, the will to fight when everyone assumes you can't, and in wooden biplanes that shouldn't have worked, against an enemy that refused to take them seriously until body counts and destroyed supplies forced recognition. The Night Witches proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy never sees coming until the bombs are already falling and the silence has returned to haunt them through another sleepless night.